I discovered my dad was cheating on my mom while she was recovering from a stroke. When I confronted him, he walked out on us. Now, before we dive into today's story, I'd love for you to take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me create even more content for you. Let's get started. My name is Benjamin, and I'm 16 years old. Growing up, I always had a strong bond with my mother, which wasn't hard since she is truly the most compassionate person I know. From my earliest memories, my mother treated me like her closest friend. She has always embraced the idea of female camaraderie, so I could share anything with her without the worry of judgment or punishment. We would shop together, watch movies, and get our hair styled. However, despite her warm and nurturing nature, she didn't let me have everything my way. I still had a curfew, and I understood my boundaries and adhered to them. My father, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. I often felt that he never really wanted to be a dad at all, as he rarely spent time with me, despite being a stay-at-home parent. Besides dropping me off and picking me up from school, he spent most of his time playing video games in his room. There were countless instances when my mother would return home after a long day of work to find my dad still engrossed in his games, neglecting to cook dinner or finish any household chores. This inevitably led to arguments, often ending with my dad storming out in anger. As I got older, I began to understand just how toxic his behavior was. My mother would plead with him constantly to find a job, or at least help her around the house, but he would spend the entire day making excuses, claiming he was playing games for research to improve his future job prospects, if he ever decided to look for one. My dad had a degree in computer science and, according to my mom, had a decent job at the beginning of their relationship. However, after she became pregnant with me, he was laid off due to downsizing at his company. This prompted him to suggest that my mom should have an abortion instead of continuing her pregnancy with me, but she firmly refused. They agreed that while she would work to support the three of us, he would take time off to care for me and handle household duties, just as any stay-at-home parent would. This arrangement was meant to be temporary, with him planning to return to work eventually, but that never happened. When I was 6, I remember my friends teasing me about my dad being unemployed and how their parents would mock my family behind our backs. It wasn't just his lack of contribution that bothered me. It was also the fact that he started to gain weight and refused to take care of himself. He would often ask one of the mothers in the neighborhood to drive me to school because he couldn't be bothered to get up early. Sometimes, he would even forget to pick me up from school. And I was fortunate that one of my classmates' parents would take me home. I'd come back to find my dad either still playing video games or napping, showing little regard for anything else. Clearly, I was being neglected, and I believe my mother noticed that. She packed our bags and decided to leave him. For a while, we moved in with my grandparents. I remember my dad visiting us, trying to persuade my mother not to go through with the divorce. Even my mom's parents supported her decision, warning my dad that he needed to change his ways, or this was the end. Thankfully, he recognized the gravity of his situation and decided to turn his life around. He began waking up early to go for morning runs and would pick me up and drop me off at my grandparents' place. During our rides, he started conversations that encouraged me to open up to him. On weekends, he took me to the park, where he introduced me to badminton for the very first time. I began to have a little fun spending time with my father, and I think my mom noticed this positive change in him. After many back-and-forth discussions, she decided to move back in with him. Eventually, my dad started losing weight due to his healthier lifestyle, and he even found a job. Although it paid significantly less than my mom's, it was still a good start for him. You might think this would mark the end of our troubles, but it actually signaled the beginning. My dad started coming home late and was always glued to his phone. Whenever I tried to talk to him, it felt as if I didn't even exist. He stopped making time for me and reverted to his old, emotionally unavailable self. My mom became increasingly suspicious of his behavior. She attempted to have serious conversations with him, but he brushed off her concerns, insisting she was overreacting. Yet, as is often the case, a mother's intuition proved accurate. My mom eventually discovered inappropriate messages on his phone with his personal trainer. She was absolutely devastated, and their ensuing fight was monumental. My dad was furious that she had snooped on his phone, repeatedly calling her a backstabber. This was the first time I witnessed both my parents screaming at each other at the top of their lungs, which terrified me. Their argument escalated to a physical altercation, and in a moment of anger, one of my dad's punches accidentally struck my mom's face, causing her to bleed from her nose. Seeing my mom in pain made me burst into tears. I had never seen so much blood and was terrified that she might die. As my dad drove us to the hospital, he insisted I had to lie about what had happened. If doctors or nurses asked, I was to say my mom had hit her face on the door. He warned me that if I told anyone the truth, he would be taken away from us, and it would be all my fault. As a child, I didn't want to bear the responsibility of losing my dad, so I kept silent. After my mom recovered, my dad promised he would cut all ties with his personal trainer and change his ways. This convinced my mom not to file a case against him, and they returned to their lives as if nothing had ever happened. When I turned 11, my mom would take me to visit her college best friend, Clara, and her husband, Thomas, every summer. We would spend a week or two at their cabin, where I always had a blast with Clara's kids, who also came to visit. My dad usually stayed home, but this year, he agreed to come with us. The first few days passed without incident, but one sunny afternoon, I couldn't nap or sit still with a book, so I decided to take a walk in the nearby woods. I wish I hadn't done that because I stumbled upon my dad making out with Clara. They weren't even trying to hide it, and if my mom or Thomas had walked into the woods at that moment, they would have easily caught them. Fear gripped me after what I had seen, and I hurried back as quietly as I could, feeling nauseous. I was torn between not wanting to anger my dad and not wanting to betray my mom. Fortunately, I didn't have to suffer in silence for long. Thomas eventually caught my dad kissing Clara by the lake. He exploded with rage and punched my dad a few times, giving him a black eye. When my mom found out, she was so furious that she lunged at both of them until Thomas had to literally hold her back. My mom was especially disappointed in my dad because she had always thought of Clara as a sister and could never have imagined they would betray her trust like this. My dad and Clara did their best to apologize and save face. My dad even tried to shift the blame onto Clara, claiming she had made the first move and he got swept away without thinking. They insisted it was a one-time mistake, but I was the only one who knew they were lying. I had seen them kissing before, and I could expose them if I wanted to, but I was too afraid to speak up. I didn't know if it was the right thing to do at my age. Those two scoundrels somehow convinced my mom and Thomas that it wouldn't happen again and that they were just drunk. However, my mom wasted no time announcing that we would be leaving, regardless of how much Clara apologized. My mom was done with her, and that was the last I ever saw of Clara. Honestly, it's sad to think about everything my mom endured with my dad, and I can't understand why she stayed with him after each betrayal. I wish she had left him back then, as it wouldn't have hindered our lives in any way. When I turned 16, my mother suffered a serious stroke while driving. Luckily, although she survived the harrowing accident, she was never the same. Overnight, our lives changed completely, as my mom became bedridden, needing to recover from a spinal injury she sustained in the crash. She could no longer get up or walk properly, and even the slightest movement caused her extreme pain and discomfort. My grandparents took turns coming over to help take care of her for those few months. I was grateful for their support because my dad had to work all day and didn't want to hire a full-time nurse. I tried to assist my mom as much as I could during that time. Every day after school, I would come home and sit with her for hours, talking to her as she drifted in and out due to her strong medications. I helped change her diapers and would rub her feet. After 2 months, my dad started complaining about how expensive everything was now that my mom wasn't working and how her insurance wasn't covering her bills enough. This really angered me, as I had seen my mom do so much around the house, and now, when she needed us the most, he was only focused on money. My grandparents offered to help my dad with a few $1,000s from their retirement fund. My grandmother even gave him some of her jewelry to pawn for cash to help take care of my mom. However, as the months went by, my dad continued to complain and took money from my grandparents whenever he could, all under the guise of taking care of my mom or paying the rent and other bills. I began to see his true colors, and my suspicions grew. I noticed he was frequently chatting with someone on his phone, just like he used to before. I devised a plan to check his messages through his MacBook to uncover what was going on. That's when I discovered he was in constant contact with a woman named Angela. I didn't go through the messages, as I knew that would be wrong, but from their recent exchanges, it was evident that my dad was cheating on my mom again. This time, the stakes were much higher. I couldn't fathom the heartbreak my mom would experience if she found out, especially in her vulnerable state. Anger swelled within me, and I knew I had to take action. I tried to get my dad's phone to delete all their messages and block Angela, hoping that would stop him from cheating. But being a naive teenager, I didn't anticipate that he would catch me. When my dad noticed that Angela had been blocked, he knew I was the only one who could have done it. He confronted me, shouting about how I dared to touch his phone. I tried to contain myself, but I couldn't hold back the anger as I yelled back, declaring that I was done watching him betray my mom. All the time, his face turned red with embarrassment. He attempted to play the innocent card, telling me that I wasn't old enough to understand what was going on, and that I should mind my own business. This only infuriated me further. I told him that I knew he was cheating on mom again with Angela, and that I had seen him kissing Clara all those years ago. I admitted that I had known since then what kind of person he was. Just then, my grandmother walked into the living room, her expression filled with concern after hearing our heated argument. She took one look at the tension between us and instantly knew something serious was happening. My dad began to stammer, trying to explain how this was none of my business and how I was too young to talk to him this way. He tried to gaslight me, insisting that as a parent, he deserved my respect, but I was done holding back. Watching my mom get sick had terrified me, and it made me fiercely protective of her. I wasn't going to let him hurt her ever again. I pointed out that all my classmates had happy families and that none of their dads had ever cheated on their wives. In my frustration, I told him I was ashamed to have him as a father and that I wished he had never been born. I didn't even know if I truly meant it at that moment, but it clearly struck a chord with him. He asked if I really meant what I was saying, and I nodded, telling him I was sick of his behavior and that my mom deserved far better than him. My outburst visibly shook my dad. In the very next moment, he declared angrily that he was done with us. I watched him pack his bags, feeling a mix of anger and confusion about what was happening. My grandmother kept asking him what he was doing, and he told her that this was why he never wanted kids, because we ruined everything. He claimed he had tried his best to be there for my mom during this tough time, but after witnessing how I spoke to him, he was finished with us. He announced that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in an unhappy relationship with my mom, so he would be moving out. He insisted that Angela loved him very much and that he didn't deserve to take any more from us. My grandmother yelled at him for being pathetic and a deadbeat father, but it didn't faze him. He had already made up his mind. The last image I have of my dad is of him walking out the door with his bags, not even bothering to say goodbye. Everything happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to process the situation. I knew I had spoken my truth, but watching him leave was incredibly difficult. Honestly, I never imagined he would actually go. I broke down in tears, blaming myself for making him move out. However, my grandmother reassured me that it wasn't my fault. She said my dad was simply a loser looking for reasons to leave, and that this had nothing to do with me. I found it hard to believe, considering I was the one who had yelled at him. In my despair, I realized that I would have to break the news to my poor mom. The thought of shattering her heart and jeopardizing her recovery overwhelmed me, and I cried even more. We waited for my grandfather to arrive, so we could talk to my mom together and gently break the news to her. Surprisingly, my mother took the news better than I expected. She looked shocked and immediately tried calling my dad multiple times, but he never picked up. After a few minutes of processing her emotions, I think my mom must have seen the fear in my eyes because she asked me to come closer for a hug. She reassured me that I had nothing to worry about, and that she had always known he was a coward. I broke down in her arms, apologizing for everything, but she told me that she had no idea how much pain I had held back all these years just to protect their feelings. She promised that we would be fine without him. I felt a wave of relief that she wasn't blaming me, even though I clearly blamed myself and felt extremely guilty for what had happened. Over the next few months, my mother focused on her recovery, while my grandparents moved in with us to help take care of her full-time. They were an immense support, allowing me to go to school every day with the peace of mind that my mom was being well taken care of. To contribute, I decided to get a part-time job tutoring a few students, which helped me bring in some money. It wasn't much, but I wanted to help my grandparents as much as I could while my mom healed. Throughout all of this, my dad never reached out to us, despite my attempts to contact him several times. I even sent a few texts apologizing, but it felt surreal and painful that my own father didn't care enough to check on us. When my mom finally recovered and was able to walk and move around like her old self, it felt like a miracle. The doctors informed us that she was completely okay, and I remained grateful to God that she was back to normal. The past few months had been draining, both mentally and physically. Once my mom was back on her feet, the first thing she did was find a divorce lawyer to start the process of ending her marriage to my dad. If you're wondering why my dad hadn't filed for divorce himself despite moving out, it was clear he didn't want to pay any child support or health insurance. He knew my mom wasn't well, so he was stalling as long as possible. However, my mom was finally done with him. When she got the divorce papers ready, she tried to get in touch with him to send them over. This was when my dad, after months of silence, reached out to her and asked if she was serious about the divorce. My mother confirmed that she was, and as expected, my dad, being the lowlife he was, begged her not to go through with it. He claimed that his girlfriend had broken up with him just weeks after leaving us, and that he had been living alone in a motel, too scared to come back home. He expressed that he had always imagined that after her recovery, she would contact him, and they could have an honest conversation. My dad went on to say that he never thought she would actually file for divorce. He pleaded with her to think it through calmly, but my mom firmly told him that if he didn't sign the papers, she would take him straight to court. They went back and forth, and I'm not sure if he ever agreed or not. However, since then, my dad has sent me several messages and voicemails, blaming me for everything. I listened to 2 of his voicemails, where he yelled at me, claiming I ruined his life and was responsible for his divorce. He even said he wished I had never been born. I showed all of this to my mom, who was furious. She told me he was just a manipulator refusing to accept his mistakes. Despite her support, I couldn't shake off the guilt. A part of me agreed with him. I wanted to share my story on Reddit today to ask if anyone else here blames me for their divorce, like my dad does. I'm struggling with my anger and the thought that maybe my outburst that day led to my dad walking out. Has anyone else gone through something similar? My mom loves me deeply, so she might be trying not to blame me to protect me from the truth. I don't want to be the reason for her unhappiness, so please be honest in the comments. I've been crying while reading all your comments. I can't believe how many strangers out there have experienced pain similar to mine. For the first time, I don't feel alone. It's strange to read everyone's stories about their dysfunctional families. I always thought other people's lives were perfect. I guess everyone has their own struggles. Some of you have actually blamed me for my parents' divorce, and even though thinking about it still makes me feel guilty, I agree that it was better for me to speak my mind to my dad rather than keep it all inside and pretend he was a good person. I never forced my dad to cheat, and I never asked him to leave us, so that decision is completely on him. Also, just to clarify, in case it wasn't clear earlier, I'm relieved that my parents are getting divorced. I want my mom to find happiness, and it seems like she's finally made a firm decision. For those curious, we don't own the house, we're renting, and after all the medical expenses she incurred, my mom has no assets left, so she won't be losing anything in the divorce. It's been a month since my last post, and a lot has transpired since then. To start, my dad unexpectedly showed up at our doorstep after months of silence, looking disheveled with a thick beard. Initially, my grandparents wouldn't let him in, but he kept apologizing and insisted he wanted one last conversation with my mom. She eventually agreed to let him in. Once inside, he started to express his remorse, breaking down as he recounted how he had reflected on his life over the past few months. He claimed to have realized that my mom was the ideal partner he had taken for granted for so long. He went on to say that Angie was nowhere near the woman my mom is, a lesson he only learned after moving in with her. He had met Angie online and thought it would be a fairy tale, but instead, they fought frequently, leading to Angie kicking him out one night, leaving him without a place to stay. Unable to return home, he ended up living in a motel. He spent most evenings drinking alone, which ultimately caused him to lose his job a few weeks ago. In a moment of desperation, he begged my mom to give him another chance and promised to change. I know this might sound touching, but knowing my dad, I couldn't help but chuckle at his performance. Even his tears seemed insincere. My mom wasn't fooled either. She smiled and told him to stop pretending. She shoved the divorce papers in front of him, insisting he sign them immediately so she could proceed with the filing. At first, he refused, but my grandparents made it clear they would investigate his finances and consider taking legal action against him for the money and jewelry he had taken from them. They were adamant that he couldn't have spent all that money on us, and likely used some for Angie. My mom warned him that the longer he delayed, the more legal fees he would incur, especially since we had ample proof of his past abuse. He then had the nerve to turn to me and ask if I felt satisfied with my actions, shaking his head in disgust and suggesting I should have kept quiet. This absurdity made me laugh even harder, while my mom shouted at him for being a selfish jerk, trying to manipulate his way out of the consequences he created. I pointed out that he had cheated on my mom multiple times, yet he was now attempting to blame me for his mistakes. My laughter seemed to frustrate him even more, and he glared at me, muttering curses under his breath. Eventually, my grandfather handed him a pen and demanded he sign the papers and leave our home. It felt empowering to see my entire family standing together against my dad. Ultimately, he had no choice but to sign. My mom promised me that this would be the last time I'd see him, since she didn't want him to come near me again and cause more trauma. It's been a few months since I last posted, and I have some good news. My parents' divorce has finally been finalized, even though it wasn't an easy process. I'm just grateful that my mom and I are free from him. The court ordered my dad to pay for my college expenses until I graduate, which I think is a good lesson for him since he rarely contributed to my life before. My mom is much healthier now and has started exercising regularly to maintain her health. For those wondering why my dad keeps blaming me, it's clear that he knew he had it good with my mom and was scared of losing her as a dependable partner. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, he chose to unfairly blame me. I see that more clearly now, and I'm glad I stood up for myself all those months ago. My grandparents have returned to their home after staying with us to help care for my mom. We visit them every weekend, and I've grown very close to them. My mom is actively seeking a new job, and I'm still tutoring. While we may not have much right now, we both agree that we feel far more liberated than we did before. I took some of your advice to heart and decided to pursue therapy when I head off to college. I've also started journaling, which has surprisingly been quite helpful. I want to express my gratitude to everyone who has supported me throughout these past few months. Your kindness and understanding have been invaluable during this difficult time. I've decided not to delete this post, as I want anyone going through a similar experience to find it and feel comforted, knowing that things can improve with time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. See you next time.